of all, on behalf of the 4 training groups for analytical psychology, I want to welcome you all to this very first Jung Memorial Lecture. I think we've been very fortunate and very honored that Dr. Joe Henderson has agreed to come all the way from San Francisco to give us this first memorial lecture, this first initiatory Jung Memorial Lecture. And that the chairman of the International Association of Analytical Psychology has also agreed to be with us tonight. Thank you both very much for coming. I'm sure that by the end of the evening, you may agree that there couldn't be a better person to give this first lecture than Joe Henderson, Joe Henderson. He's, after all, one of the few persons left who knew Jung and who was in analysis with Jung. But he also has very strong links to London, and in particular to the RSM, and because he was a medical student in London. And it is a particular pleasure for us tonight that his lifelong friend and colleague from the same medical school, Michael Fordham, should also be here to share it with us. In order to introduce to you the person, Joe Henderson, I will very rapidly and briefly mention some of the facts about him. He was born in a small ranching town in Nevada. Then he got a degree in French literature from Princeton in 1927. He then started off his career as a book reviewer, drama critic, and writer in California, where his parents had moved. Then somebody introduced him to Jung, and he started to read 1 or 2 things of Jung, and he suddenly knew what he must do. So in 1929, he came to Europe, to Zurich, and worked with Jung. But in 1930, he decided to move to London and studied medicine at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. And in September 1934, he married an Englishwoman, Helena Darwin Cornford. So see various reasons why he should be here tonight. In 1938, having finished his medical studies, he and Helena returned to New York, and Joe Henderson first started to practice as an analyst. But realizing in 1941 that perhaps after all he belonged to California, he and his family moved to San Francisco, and he's been there ever since. Dr. Henderson has packed an enormous amount of things into his life. He's been an analyst ever since 1938. He has taught analytical psychology. He has founded analytical psychology institutes and groups and societies, as well as teaching and founding other organizations to do with medicine and psychotherapy. But above all, he has written much and widely. An adventurous and creative thinker with far-reaching interests and a tremendous range of scholarship, he has extended the frontiers of analytical psychology and deepened its clinical and theoretical formulations. He could not and would not keep Jung as a sort of static, lifeless, worshipful relic under a glass bowl, to be admired but not touched. Instead, he has extended it, developed it, added to it, played with it, and indefatigably explored its use and its relevance in ever-widening contexts and fields of study. In addition to the many papers, he has written several books, of which perhaps the best known are Thresholds of Initiation, Wisdom of the Serpent, Cultural Attitudes and in Psychological Perspectives, and Shadow and the Self. Surveying his searches, researches, and guiding preoccupations, that is culture, cultural unconscious, initiation, rights and thresholds, transference, symbols, arts and aesthetics. I think of them all as sort of probes that reveal something of the essence, the texture, and the wellspring of the core of the person, Joe Henderson. I thank Joe for coming here, and I thank Tom for being with us, and I ask Joe to give us his talk.
I use both of these things. Can you hear me everywhere? Thank you very much for your nice introduction, Rosemary. Very nice indeed. And I am very honored to be invited to come and give this memorial lecture for Jung, especially in London, where I feel so happy to be and often miss being here, living so far away. When I was asked to give this lecture, I wondered what it would be like to address 4 different groups of Jungian analysts. 4 is the magic number so dear to Jung, and would there be some emanation of his influence to suggest the possibility of their becoming an ordered whole? But we are all different, not only by belonging to a certain group, but we are all different not only by, we are different because we have had analysis with 1 or 2 individual analysts whose personality and theoretical beliefs make us feel understood. Yes, but it is not quite so simple, because the counterpole of this influence is a normal reaction of resistance to our analyst. We want not only to change ourselves, but also the analyst as a dominant authority. We do not need to kill the father in the old Oedipus model, but according to Silberer, merely wish to remove and improve him so that we can find our own methods and authority. Throughout this process, the personality and theoretical convictions of the original analyst programs much of our analysis and awakens us to our individual style. In no other branch of science I know is this peculiar union of the personal and the theoretical to be found. Of course, it can lead to suffocating dogmatism, but at its best it creates a wonderful enthusiasm for the work. It even makes love a part of the scientific adventure, because we love the analyst who gave us the opportunity to embark upon it. But the positive transference has to be resolved, and then what do we do with its theoretical blood brother? Well, as the personal transference changes, so may the theory that goes with it. What I mean to say is that analysis and resolution of the transference, with all its personal association, then demands a revision of the theory with which it is endowed. This preamble leads me to the subject of this lecture, which promises to discuss Jung's psychology with its additions and extensions. Actually, this promises far more than I am able to do. You all have your own experiences and ideas to draw upon, and I do not know any group of analysts better equipped to know and judge these factors than are to be found here in London. What I propose to talk about, therefore, is my own limited personal experience of such additions I have found important to make in the course of my own development, and I will include certain others that I have found particularly relevant, especially some that have come to my attention in our institute in San Francisco. As I have been designated as a, quote, classical Jungian in Andrew Samuel's book, Jung and the Post-Jungians, I can say that I acknowledge this label, and I do not feel, however, I quite belong there without stating that I also belong to an earlier period, perhaps pre-classical. I began my analysis with Jung in 1929 before there were any societies or institutes. Jung had only two assistants, Fräulein Antonia Wolff and Godwin Baines, both of whom were more Jungian than Jung. Coming from California with Baines' encouragement to begin analysis with Jung, I was certainly prepared to become a classical Jungian, I suppose. And both Jung's theory and his practice did seem to be made to order for my therapeutic needs. My textbook, which even was a sort of Bible at times, which I read over and over, was Symbols of Transformation of the Libido in Beatrice Hinkle's less than perfect translation, Psychology of the Unconscious. In spite of this marvelous statement of Jung's declaration of independence from Freud and from the reductionism of everything to the sexual level of experience, there was a strong sense of their continuing relation, something that was no longer personal but a part of their scientific legacy to their followers. But of course, their personal as well as their theoretical divergence was still troublesome for all of us at that time. My reaction to this rift in their relationship first appeared in a dream I had early in my analysis. I dreamed that a woman of my acquaintance had been given a present from Freud and Jung of a porcelain figurine of Kuan Yin, the Chinese Buddhist bodhisattva. They had given her this present because she was blind, as if to compensate for her blindness. Now, this lady was not blind. She was, in fact, an open-eyed extrovert who had had a very productive analysis with Jung 2 years earlier. Presumably, Freud's and Jung's present to her represented the intrinsic value of her analysis. But why would they give her an art object of a religious nature which she could not see if she was blind? I stumbled over this paradox a long time until I realized that it presented me with a new insight. I was the blinded one needing treatment. Since infancy, I have been partially blind in my left eye as the result of an infection. And this injury, of course, had a strong effect upon my earliest relation to my parents and their relation to me. But the dream used this early trauma to symbolize an inner awareness that depth psychology was bringing not only to me, but to us all, so new that I would have to learn to be blind in a new way, blind to the confusion of an over-extroverted modern life in order to perceive inwardly its archetypal value. Freud had opened the way, and Jung had deepened it immeasurably. But my dream implied I should think of their influence as coexistent and continuous, and not let their splitting trigger something similar in myself. The figure of the Bodhisattva then spoke to me of the need for a certain kind of compassion. You know, Bodhisattva is a symbol of a person who has outlived their usefulness on this earth and is ready for some kind of perfection. But instead of going to nirvana, they go back into life to help those who are needing still instruction. This was a figure not religious in itself, but had the capacity for giving of itself freely to the lowest and most needy elements of the psyche as a model for psychotherapy. Jung told a story about the goddess Kuan Yin that he had heard that she was, of course, very holy and very compassionate. But when she went down to hell, down to the lower depths, to feed and to have compassion for the devils, she had to change herself into a devil, because they would be shocked by her heavenly radiance. Jung said, you see, those people had a psychology, a philosophy of evil as well as good. I needed correction for thinking that in becoming a doctor, I had not yet gone to medical school but was planning to do so, I would be serving science instead of serving humanity. I also needed to learn that the new psychology, especially Jung's, was imbued with the spirit of natural philosophy, about which I will say more later. I have cited this dream once before in a paper called The Self and Individuation as providing access to the self and on a psychological level to the awakening of the inferior function as a personal and psychological vehicle for its understanding. But of course, at that time, I had no inkling of such development. Instead, I had another dream indicating that the previous dream had not awakened a deep enough response from the unconscious. This second dream had no visual imagery at all. I simply knew that deep in the earth below me, two lakes which had been separate but close to each other began to flow together. I also knew, but without seeing her, that my sister was present. I had no personal association to the lakes, but I was moved by their flow from one to the other to form one lake. My sister was 8 years older than I, and in early adolescence I idealized her so that she carried an image of the anima that had helped my emotional development beyond the original mother. I think you can see how this second dream shows a stirring of the collective unconscious as the primordial and elemental matrix of consciousness. The previous dream, by contrast, uses an imagery with religious and aesthetic symbolization in a known historical frame of reference, reflecting a conscious as well as an unconscious association. The contrast between these two dreams illustrates why I have chosen to speak of a cultural unconscious as distinct from the collective unconscious, but related to it. Both dreams have a personal context represented by my woman friend in the first and my sister in the second, but the central content of each is quite different. In the first, there is a culturally recognizable image, while in the second, the content is simply apprehended, not seen, just as the content of the collective unconscious is beyond both personal and cultural imagery, beyond what has previously been acquired by education. I'm reminded here of a statement by Hobson, which was made in a review, I think, of Jung's, one of Jung's volumes. I think it was The Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. This was many years ago, but it always made an impression on him. He said, he raised the question as to whether it is appropriate to refer to archetypes by such names as mother, child, trickster, or even rebirth. These names imply a particular matter or content. And it might be we shall have to evolve abstract formal methods of representing the archetypes such as are used in mathematics or mathematical logic. Von Franz, in a sense, did just that sometime later in her book Number and Time. I also wrote a paper on the psychology of numbers. But the more familiar objects and personalizations represented by the cultural unconscious are what they are and need not be reduced to anything else. Jung's criterion for archetypal representation, that the fantasy image must not have been acquired through education, tradition, language, or indirectly through religious ideas, is impossible to substantiate if it is purely archetypal. But if we refer to the cultural psyche, the traditional artifacts have their appropriate place. By this circuitous route, I was led to formulate the idea of a cultural unconscious, which I described in a paper at the 6th International Congress of Analytical Psychology in London. It did not attract much attention, as I remember. The best that could be said was that no one seemed to mind it very much, but I thought it did nothing to add anything essentially new. But in 1987, it became the centerpiece for a national conference of Jungian analysts in Chicago, called The Cultural Unconscious, where, along with other similar papers, it seemed to come of age. And I then saw that this possible revision could be useful in a clinical context, not just as a theory, with personal significance for me. By clinical, I mean it taught me, as well as others, to use this model for interpreting dreams more accurately. With this model, I interpret dreams as if they combine three types of imagery: the personal, the cultural, and the archetypal, in an arrangement that features all three, or at times one of them, or two in tandem. The personal level of dreams frequently corrects Jung's idea that they only reflect the personal unconscious. These so-called personal dreams also more often reflect a cultural conditioning. One of our San Francisco analysts, Lewis Stewart, has shown in a work soon to be published that significant connections exist between cultural attitudes and kinship patterns in families, which childhood memories bring to light. He illustrates this with reference to the childhood memories of Freud, Adler, Jung, and Rank, localizing their places in their family hierarchy. This seems to me to open an important line of research, illuminating that gray area of personal life experience as it fades into the cultural tradition of the family, into which a child is born and from which it receives its first real stimulus for later cultural development. This way of looking at family patterns of development seems to me to add something to Michael Fordham's classic contribution to the understanding of early childhood, where de-integration of the self takes place not just archetypally, but in providing personal values of a cultural nature for each individual in the family system. In that sense, the child creates its own mythology, which may become an individuating experience, as Michael Fordham so clearly shows. The archetypal area of the psyche was, of course, Jung's great field of exploration, and I readily forgave him for not spending as much time as I would have liked analyzing my personal problems. Instead, I learned how valuable mythology may be for processing the cultural psyche, which is also felt to be personal. That is, when it is also felt to be personal. Unfortunately, Jung did not always clearly differentiate images reflecting archetypes per se from the cultural artifacts which stereotypically represent them. This led me, along with many early analysts, to explain things mythologically that belonged in the personal or the cultural psyche, and therefore risked setting up resistances in our patients. I'm glad to say that I think this period is well in the past, and that the analysts I know use mythology where it really supplies, and not just as a loose analogy. The use of mythology for amplifying dreams has extended beyond Jung's original use of it to an astonishing degree, so that it is no longer confined to dream interpretation, but has become a method of invoking or interpreting fantasy material of all kinds in the spirit of play. Winnicott's work, especially when used by Fordham, has been valuable for many Jungians to understand the early patterns of childhood, where, as I have said, mythology, in a sense, is born and flourishes spontaneously. Of course, we know the importance of play in Jung's report of his own spirit of play in processing the unconscious after his break with Freud. After this, he went on to develop a genuine talent for painting, sculpture, and architectural design, as shown in the Red Book and in his house at Bollingen. Michael Fordham has described this interestingly in his book Jungian Psychotherapy as a use of artwork and of Jung's early experience of making his own transitional object in the Winnicottian sense. I see this also as a separation rite of passage, where initiation first appears in its archetypal context. It bears a striking likeness to the quest for a guardian spirit found in the tribal societies. Let us pause for a moment to look more closely at this kind of transition from unconsciously motivated, playful activity to the self-conscious artist, where the content of the work and the craft to complete it are of equal importance. It was surprising to me as an analysant in Zurich to learn how ambivalent Jung was to art and artists in general. I knew some artists who were his patients, and many of them complained that they had to protect their identity from his negative reaction. Much has been made of Jung's story in Memories, Dreams, Reflections about the voice of his anima commenting to him about his writing. I believe it was the writing of Symbols of Transformation. She said, his anima said, "This is art," and he, quote, caught her saying it a second time and said, "No, it is not art. On the contrary, it is nature." End of quote. Then he says he quote, "gave up an aestheticizing tendency in favor of a rigorous process of understanding and a return wholly to reality, which, quote, meant scientific comprehension, and this was to become a life work." End of quote. This science, of course, was psychology of a kind not yet created, in which objective thinking was used, but sought to blend both art and nature. As I say, much has been made of this story, implying that Jung rejected art because it seemed to come from some kind of unreliable emotionality. As I see it today, Jung knew he was being tempted to confuse a traditional cultural attitude with the new psychological attitude he was about to create. Therefore, he feared being trapped in a cultural prejudice, just as the devotees of art for art's sake had been in the late 19th century. In recent years, I have described 4 basic cultural attitudes: the religious, the philosophic, the aesthetic, and the social. The religious, the philosophic, the aesthetic, and the social. Jung had a strong religious attitude aligned with a philosophic attitude, but at this crucial period he did not allow these attitudes to inhibit his psychological attitude any more than he did the aesthetic attitude with which he was well endowed. But about religion and philosophy he had no ambivalence. His religious attitude was clearly defined and differentiated, and his philosophic attitude was fully acknowledged. In a recent work of Marilyn Nagy, a San Francisco analyst, called Philosophical Issues in the Psychology of C.G. Jung, just published this year, she sees his early influence as placing him somewhere between a religious and a philosophic position. She quotes him from the revised edition of Symbols of Transformation, where he says, Psychologic truth by no means excludes metaphysical truth. All knowledge of the psyche is itself psychic. The soul is the only experient of life and existence." End of quote. Then she says, the philosophy of Jung, which he acquired in early years, stemmed from Plato and Kant. She says, end quote, Jung substituted inner experience for Kant's concept of a priori reason, and both men meant that there is something inside the individual which knows what to do. This experience is not dictated by the perceptual and sensual power of the outer object. For Kant, this was the experience of the categorical imperative. For Jung, it was the experience of the self. So much for the religious and philosophic attitudes in the early work of Jung. But the aesthetic attitude remained a stumbling block, so that his followers have had to revise and add to it. Gerhard Adler and Erich Neumann both early pointed out Jung's failure to appreciate modern art as a significant development, synchronous with his own work. Neumann even wrote a whole monograph on Henry Moore's sculpture, and Aniela Jaffe made an excellent Jungian study of modern art, including abstract expressionism in Man and His Symbols. A recent symposium abounds in references to Jung's psychology in the spectrum of modern art, literature, dance, and architecture, a book called C.G. Jung and the Humanities. So, in the end, Jung's affirmation of the aesthetic attitude comes through in his followers. Now, if we look for an equivalent manifestation of a social attitude, we are disappointed. Both Freud and Jung talked about the importance of having a Weltanschauung, but neither of them seems to make enough psychologically of this need. A true social attitude, however, in the sense I use it, is found in Alfred Adler's psychology. James Hillman explicates this contribution very well in his book, Healing Fiction, but I think it needs to be carried into further depth. The need for this is in a Jungian context was particularly made good in Progoff's book, Jung's Psychology and Its Social Meaning, and there is also a book called Jung and Politics, The Political Social Ideas of C.G. Jung by V.W. Odeinik, and also by Neumann's Jung's Psychology and the New Ethic. But we are still left with intriguing and disturbing questions concerning Jung's stand on some important social issues of his own and our time in history. The real trouble is that he did not have a social attitude which could compare with his other attitudes, the religious, the philosophic, or even the aesthetic. So we may be wrong to expect it and to criticize him unduly as if he should have one of equal strength with the others. I tried to formulate what a Jungian contribution might be today in my monograph on cultural attitudes, which is called Cultural Attitudes in Psychological Perspective. There I discussed a social attitude first because I felt it was the least represented and the least understood by Jung. I wanted to show that this attitude, as well as others, may be an avenue to individuation. Last year in San Francisco, we had a public lecture series called Psyche and World, and there seemed to emerge from this a sense that the time had come to acknowledge the importance of Jung's psychology, not only for groups like our own, composed of people who've had Jungian analysis, but to explore its relevance for larger groups of people who have not been formally analyzed. If it is to have meaning for individuation, it must do justice both to its individual quality and its behavior pattern in the world. In respect to this outer dimension, Jung remained an introverted linear thinker with a pessimistic persuasion that large groups cannot change in any basic sense. They just go on repeating their old mistakes. Yet his own optimistic expectations for change in individuals like himself might have given him some hope of improvement in the body politic. If he had not grown up in the cultural climate prior to World War I think this would have been possible. Intellectual people of that time shared a general optimism about social change that still reflected the philosophy of the Enlightenment of the 18th century. So they experienced the after effect of the First World War as a shock from which they could never fully recover, because this period was followed by the dictatorships in Germany, Italy, and Spain with their threat to liberal principles in government. Jung's last years were spent during the most unyielding period of the Cold War. While this did not personally affect him as a Swiss citizen, I think it clouded his judgment at times. I remember he even spoke of Franklin Roosevelt as a dictator at one time. Social organization was always suspect. When we were founding an institute in San Francisco, he told my colleague, Dr. Wheelwright, that if we must have an organization, we should keep it as unorganized as possible. Naturally, we did no such thing and are still working on how to improve our organization. The absence of an effective social attitude has recently been addressed, interestingly, by Arthur Coleman, a Jungian analyst in San Francisco, who is also a group consultant, whose work is based on the Tavistock Group Relationships Conference. In our society, he also leads a group relations seminar which uses Jung's individuation process as its model. In a recent paper of his called Depth Consultation, he proposes, I quote, a marriage between Jungian analysis and organizational consultation. End of quote. From a classical Jungian perspective, this sounds like pure heresy. Jung had said that, I quote, individuation is exclusive adaptation to inner reality. But Coleman points out that in an early paper of 1916, Jung says that the sacrifice by the individual of his identity in the outer collective must be compensated, or, as he says, expiated, by the ability to create equivalent values. These equivalent values must be social in nature because, he says, society has a right to expect realizable values. For the existing society is always of absolute importance as a transition through which world development passes, and it demands the highest collaborative achievement from every individual. End of quote. Since Coleman seeks to broaden the concept of individuation currently applied to individuals, he seeks to include individuation in the collective as well as in the individual. After giving several examples of how this depth consultation works, he concludes by saying, perhaps it is in that commitment to help others, valuing others who share our cosmic home as much as ourselves, that Jung's concept of equivalent values will find its greatest meaning. End of quote. If Jung was at fault or old-fashioned or generally lacking in social awareness in the world, he was remarkably effective and socially innovative with individuals and small groups. He drew strength from a source of energy that might be likened to Jane Harrison's description of Themis, the Greek goddess of the social community who represented a unity of feeling for the significant reality of human relationship. With this, Jung was particularly effective in helping his patients resolve their transferences to him. Having been one of his patients, I recall how meaningful it was to feel not just a dissolution of the transference, but the creation of a human relationship to replace it. Trying to formulate this some years later, I called resolution of the transference in this sense, at least in those patients mature enough to stand on their own feet, a symbolic friendship which is arrived at through blending the personal and archetypal experiences that were originally activated. Now I would like to discuss this a little more fully. The friendship to which I referred is symbolic in the sense that it leaves completely open and undefined the nature of its expression. It exists in its pure form when analyst and patient meet humanly without expecting undue approval or disapproval. The liminal period of analysis has been transcended but not at all forgotten, so that its transformation from liminality to establishment of what Victor Turner calls society, societas, may emerge. It can never be social in a collective sense, complete with protective persona, but has made possible an undefended attitude to life in general. As a result of their work together, both analyst and patient have invested an appropriate fund of libido in the therapeutic relationship, And so it is as if this shared experience allows the patient to individuate by establishing some kind of social contrast with the analyst, binding not only for them, but for a wider and deeper experience of other relationships as well. I was a member of Jung's Dream Seminar in Zurich in 1929 and 30, when he was interpreting the dreams of a Swiss businessman, and we came to a dream which he said told him that this man was now ready to take charge of his own part of the analysis from then on. He dreamt that he and his analyst had established a joint account at a bank from which money could be withdrawn. I remember the effect of this in subsequent sessions upon us in the group. It had a cathartic effect when this stage of development had been reached. Up to that time, we had been semi-paralyzed by the implicit injunction that we should regard ourselves as strictly individual, and this had a somewhat isolating effect. We sat in our chairs as if they were fortresses. From then on, there was, in the seminar, a sense of group relationship being made possible by this demonstration. I say it was made possible. It never became an ongoing reality or in that or any other group of Jungians I knew then, and perhaps it could not in Jung's powerful presence. This took place when we had to form our own groups as Jung's followers outside Zurich. We are still working on this problem in San Francisco and see it as an open field of exploration for bringing about a new cultural cohesion, whereby our groups, while honoring our differences from others, may still rest on common ground. Having talked mainly about possible changes, additions in Jungian theory, I would like now to mention, though I cannot go into them at any length fully, some of the additions to what Jung himself would have approved as continuing his own special interests. One of these is represented by von Franz's study of the complementarity found between modern physics and psychology, and this has been furthered in Rossi's recent contributions to the journal Psychological Perspectives, published in Los Angeles. Then there is Anthony Stevens' contribution to biological theory as it supports Jung's basic hypotheses concerning the psychoid nature of the archetype. Further work has been done with interesting modifications of Jung's typology by John Beebe and June Singer, and perhaps others I do not know. As a psychotherapist, first and foremost, I have been specially interested in the anthropological psychological perspectives for our work. In my attempt to define a psychological attitude as distinct from other cultural attitudes, I have found support from Claude Lévi-Strauss, Swiss businessman, and we came to a dream which the English social anthropologist from the English social anthropologist in 1916, Jung says that the sacrifice by the individual of his identity in the outer collective must be compensated as a result of John Layard's studies of the Malekula Islanders, and this knowledge fertilized his contribution to the psychology of the transference, as you know. Layard also extended it in his own analytical work, as well shown in a book called by Neumann's Jung Psychology and the New Ethic, amplification from mythology, to help understand more deeply the significance of the incest taboo. This mythological dimension of knowledge has been carried on during the last 40 years by such Jungian fellow travelers as Mircea Eliade, Carl Kerényi, and Joseph Campbell. In spite of their contributions, Jung's attempt to establish a science of mythology in his collaboration with Karenyi is still a sleeping beauty that no one has taken seriously as a project for the future. However, there is a movement in that direction in the methods of representing the archetype for research in archetypal symbolism, which is being developed in New York and San Francisco with increasing success to supply the mythological materials that a science of mythology would need to draw upon. An impressive book illustrating the work done so far is to appear this next month in April, published by Shambhala Press. Charles Taylor of New York and Anne-Marie Ronenberg, as curator of the archive, have produced this book, edited by Beverly Moon, and I have written an introduction. I would not like to leave you with the impression that I think all major changes in Jungian theory are cultural, sociological, anthropological, or aesthetic. My own work still relies heavily upon Jung's view that individuation is most fully realized in the second half of life. And I do find that
analytical psychology,
a majority of my patients
I want to
that I have
welcome you all
seen
to this very first
are
Jung
over
Memorial
35 or 40 years and have need for this type
I
of
think
development.
we've been very fortunate.
As we know, this aspect of Jung's psychology often seems to conflict with therapeutic methods more appropriate to the stages of development during childhood and adolescence. In my work as a training analyst, I frequently have to enter into a dialogue with analysts who are trained primarily in the developmental stages of early life. Accordingly, I have learned something new from them, while they, I hope, have learned something old from me. But young and old are stereotypes that suggest a polarity that needs to be processed further.
For coming.
In such a dialogue that can be set up between them, and also what is sometimes called clinical versus symbolic analysis, I look for a chance to bridge the existing polarity by bringing it out of conflict, not into resolution, but into a new complementarity. There's a great difference between conflict as something polarized and conflict as a sense of complementarity. I also still find in Jung's demonstration of alchemy these factors that are for a full experience of the analytical process, and at certain times a way of carrying forward the older but ever-living tradition of natural philosophy, making possible a more enduring psychological attitude for our future. So now I would like to summarize briefly and bring to conclusion what I've tried to say concerning Jung's own development and the tradition that he has left with us. I think that Jung's initial work was philosophical and religious as well as psychological. The influence of Kant, Schopenhauer, and the 19th century vitalists is clearly seen, while Plato's Idola form a subliminal foundation for Jung's theory of archetypes. It would be possible to claim that Jung never really created a modern psychology at all because the psycho-religious impression is so strong in those early years. Jung's own defense of his psychology as being scientific is based on his assertion that his method of observation was empirical, and a good many people have questioned that. I think he was right in claiming this because he was influenced early on by William James, collective as well as in the individual. And he said of James, pragmatism, you know, he really meant it. That was an expression of Jung's respect for the reality of the psyche, which he later went on to expound at such length. He felt that in William James he got that first message. And this means that he quite early affirmed a genuine pragmatism as being completely compatible with a religious attitude, as shown especially in his admiration for James' book, Varieties of Religious Experience. But this still did not make Jung's psychology truly his own, and the early work does all too often rest on certain articles of faith. After a certain time, I think this changed, and he was able to formulate a psychological attitude that was truly unique and truly his own. I date this time beginning during or immediately after his trip to India in 1936. I think 6 or 7, but I think 36. His answer to the religious and philosophical ideas of the Far East brought him a new awareness of the Celtic religion of the West. He tells in a dream that he was his interest suddenly switched from the East to the Celtic West. After this, he reached back to what he called natural philosophy, represented by Paracelsus and Gerard Dawn. This, too, was predicated in a dream, that of being imprisoned in the 17th century as the culminating period of philosophic alchemy. In this period, he did not, however, merely study alchemy, but produced a number of works that speak of what I think represents the new psychological attitude. The two major essays given as lectures of the Eranos Society, his study of synchronicity, the answer to Job, the psychology of the transference, and finally the Mysterium Conjunctionis. So finally, in these works, Jung reveals himself as the best revisionist of his own theories. Application and practice of them resides chiefly with ourselves, his followers, from which, of course, other theories may arise in time. Thank you.
We are most grateful to you, Dr. Henderson, for what you've given us. I have a suspicion that some of the things I said or hinted at were proved by your talk. And I think it was most comprehensive. It took us all around the theories and problems that we have to face and deal with. And I'm most grateful to you for coming to us and for giving us this first Jungian lecture. Thank you very much.